In 1852, a man named Thomas Whaley stood in a crowd in San Diego and watched a stranger choke to death at the end of a rope. 3 years later, Whaley bought the ground where the gallows had stood. He built a house on it, not just any house, the finest home in Southern California. He raised 6 children inside those walls, and then, one by one, the house began to take them back. In the late summer of 1852, San Diego was not yet a city. It was a collection of adobe buildings and dirt roads clustered on a mesa above a quiet harbor, home to perhaps 800 people, most of them recently arrived, and most of them uncertain whether they would stay. California had been a state for only 2 years. The law was new here, and it was unevenly applied, and it carried the particular severity of men who believed that order had to be built from nothing. On the 18th of September, a man was brought from a small adobe jail to a set of gallows on the edge of town. His name was James Robinson, though most people called him Yankee Jim. He was a Canadian of French descent, tall, 6 feet 3 or 4 inches by most accounts, broad, and by reputation dangerous. He had drifted down from the northern mining camps, where rumors followed him like debts. Some said he had robbed miners in remote places. Some said worse. But robbery and rumor were not what brought him to the gallows that morning. What brought him there was a rowboat. In August of that year, Yankee Jim and 2 accomplices had stolen a small boat from San Diego Harbor. Their apparent intention was to use the vessel to hijack a commercial ship at anchor, though they never followed through. The boat was recovered on a beach a few miles south. The 3 men were arrested. What happened next tells you more about the town than it does about the crime. Robinson was tried before a court of sessions, a county judge, and 2 justices of the peace, on a charge of grand larceny. Under a California statute passed the previous year, grand larceny was punishable by death. The jury of 12 men returned a guilty verdict and recommended the maximum sentence. Among those 12 jurors sat at least one of the men who owned the stolen boat. The punishment for taking a rowboat without permission would be hanging by the neck until dead. That night, Robinson laughed. He told the 2 Catholic priests who came to counsel him that the sentence was a bluff, a scare tactic, a grim joke meant to teach him a lesson. No civilized court would execute a man over a boat. He refused their spiritual guidance. He said he would not actually hang. The next morning, they led him to the gallows. It was a crude structure, 2 heavy timber posts set in the ground with a crossbar nailed across the top. The method was simple. The condemned man would stand on the back of a wagon. A noose would be placed around his neck. The wagon would be driven forward, and the man would drop. Yankee Jim was permitted to address the crowd. He spoke to the gathered townspeople, claiming he had given piles of gold to help poor men. Then they stood him on the wagon and placed the rope around his neck. It was at this point, according to the available accounts, that Robinson understood this was not a performance. The wagon lurched forward. He tried to keep his feet on the boards as long as he could, then he fell. But the scaffolding had not been built for a man of his height. The drop was too short. His boots grazed the sand beneath him. His neck did not break. Instead, he swung, slowly, heavily, and strangled. Some accounts say it took as long as 45 minutes. The crowd watched. Among them, standing somewhere in that gathering of merchants and settlers and soldiers, was a 28-year-old New Yorker named Thomas Whaley. We do not have a record of what Whaley thought as he watched Robinson die. We do not know if he looked away or if he stayed until the body was cut down. What we know is that he was there, and that he saw it, and that 3 years later he purchased the lot where the gallows had stood. 9 lots in all, roughly 8.5 acres, for $302. He bought the land knowing what had happened on it. He bought it despite being warned by locals that the ground carried something with it. He did not believe in curses or spirits or residual stain. He believed in brick and commerce and progress, and he intended to build a house. Not just any house. A house that would announce in fired clay and imported glass that Thomas Whaley had arrived, that San Diego had arrived, that the future was being built right here, on this mesa, on this dirt, above this harbor, and that whatever had happened on this ground before was simply the cost of civilization finding its footing. The gallows were taken down. The earth was cleared. Thomas Whaley began manufacturing bricks at his own brickyard on Conde Street, the first kiln-fired bricks ever produced in San Diego County. He would build his house from the ground itself. The same soil that had absorbed the weight of a dying man's boots would now be pressed into molds, baked in a kiln, and stacked into walls. It is worth pausing here before the house rises to consider what Thomas Whaley was actually doing. He was not merely building a home. He was making an argument. The argument was that a man of sufficient will and means could take the worst ground in town. Ground marked by public death, ground the neighbors would not touch, and transform it into the best address in Southern California. He was betting his family's future on the proposition that what you build matters more than what came before. It was a reasonable bet. It was also wrong. Thomas Whaley was born on the 5th of October 1823 in New York City, the 7th of 10 children in a family that had been in America for a century. The Whaleys were Scots-Irish, descended from an Alexander Whaley who had crossed the Atlantic in 1722 and settled near Plymouth, Massachusetts. Alexander was a gunsmith by trade and a patriot by conviction. He participated in the Boston Tea Party. He provided flintlock muskets to Continental soldiers during the Revolutionary War. He offered his Long Island home to General George Washington for military use. The family understood, from its earliest American generation, that building something meant risking it. Thomas's father, also named Thomas, carried on the family trade, manufacturing locks and hardware in New York. He served in the state militia during the War of 1812. He married Rachel Pye, whose father manufactured locks in Brooklyn, and together they built a prosperous business called Whaley and Pye. When the elder Thomas died in 1832, his will specified that his 9-year-old son should receive a liberal education. The boy was sent to the Washington Institute, and afterward he traveled Europe for 2 years with a private tutor named Emile Mallet. By the time Thomas Whaley was 20, he was literate in French, experienced in trade, and accustomed to a certain quality of life. He was not a man who expected to sleep on dirt. But on the 1st of January, 1849, Thomas Whaley boarded a ship called the Sutton, reportedly the first vessel to leave New York Harbor for California after the news of gold, and sailed for a world that had nothing in common with the parlors and counting houses of Manhattan. The voyage took 204 days. When he arrived in San Francisco in July of 1849, the city was a chaos of canvas tents, mud streets, and desperate optimism. Thousands of men had come for gold. Thomas Whaley had come to sell them the tools to find it. He did not go to the mines. He opened a mercantile store with a partner named George Wardle on Montgomery Street, selling hardware and woodwork shipped from his family's New York business, along with mining equipment and utensils on consignment. It was a shrewd calculation. The miners might strike gold or they might not, but they all needed shovels, and the man who sold the shovels prospered regardless. Whaley prospered. Within 2 years, he had established his own storefront, erected a 2-story residence near the bay, and begun renting out additional properties. He was 27 years old, and he was building something real in a place where most men were chasing vapor. Then, in May of 1851, fire took it all. An arson blaze swept through the district and destroyed Whaley's buildings on Montgomery Street. The inventory, the storefront, the residence, all of it gone. San Francisco in that era burned with regularity. 6 major fires struck the city between 1849 and 1851. But knowing that fire was common did not make the loss abstract. Thomas Whaley had built a life from raw lumber in a raw city, and he watched it disappear in an afternoon. A lesser man might have gone home. Whaley went south. On the advice of a merchant named Louis Franklin, who operated stores in both San Francisco and San Diego, Whaley sailed for the small settlement on the southern coast. He arrived in October of 1851 and opened a general store with Franklin called the Tienda California. He learned to speak Spanish so he could trade with the local Kumeyaay people and the remaining Mexican families in the area. Within a year, Franklin had sold his share, and Whaley was cycling through a series of business partners. Francis Hinton, Ephraim Morse, his own brother Henry, building, dissolving, rebuilding. The pattern was becoming familiar. Thomas Whaley did not stop when things fell apart. He simply started again, in a slightly different configuration, on slightly different ground. In 1853, he returned briefly to New York and married Anna Eloise Delaunay on the 14th of August. Anna was 11 years his junior, born in 1832 to a French family in the city. She was refined, educated, and by all accounts devoted to Thomas from the start. They traveled back to San Diego together, arriving in December of 1853, and moved into a rented property called the Gila House. Their first child, a boy named Francis Hinton after Thomas's business partner, was born the following year. The family was taking shape. What it needed now was a house, and not merely a house. Thomas Whaley had lost a business to arson in San Francisco. He had watched buildings made of wood vanish overnight. He would not build in wood again. He would build in brick. Brick that he manufactured himself, in a kiln he constructed with his own capital, using machines he imported from the East Coast. In May of 1855, he and a partner purchased 2 Vervelin patent horsepower brickmaking machines for $2,500. One was set up near Old Town, the other at La Playa, convenient for shipping. Thomas Whaley would control the material from the earth to the wall. No one else's negligence or malice would take this from him. In September of 1855, he purchased the lots in Old Town where the gallows had stood. He knew what the ground was. He had seen what had happened there, and he chose it anyway because the location was good, and because Thomas Whaley was a man who believed that what you built on a piece of land mattered more than what had been done on it before. He was about to test that belief with everything he had. On the 6th of May, 1856, Thomas Whaley laid the first bricks of his new home and recorded his ambition plainly. "My new house, when completed, will be the handsomest, most comfortable and convenient place in town or within 150 miles of here." It was not a hope. It was a declaration, and he was right. The house rose in Greek Revival style, a form Thomas chose with deliberation. In the middle of the 19th century, Greek Revival was the architecture of democratic aspiration. It announced classical taste, civic seriousness, and permanence. It was the style of courthouses and banks and the homes of men who intended to be remembered. In a town of single-story adobes and rough timber frames, a 2-story brick residence with symmetrical facades and clean proportions was not merely a home. It was a statement that civilization had arrived on this mesa, and that it intended to stay. Thomas designed the house himself. Every brick came from his own brickyard on Conde Street. Kiln-fired, uniform, the first manufactured bricks in San Diego County. The walls went up course by course through the summer and into the fall. By the time the house was finished in 1857, it had cost more than $10,000, a sum that would have purchased several lesser properties outright. But Thomas Whaley was not building a lesser property. He was building proof. The interior matched the exterior's ambition. Brussels carpets covered the floors. Mahogany and rosewood furniture filled the parlor and dining room. Damask drapes hung in the windows. The house had a formal parlor, a sitting room, a dining room, a kitchen, and a study on the ground floor, with bedrooms upstairs arranged around a central hallway. There was a granary attached to the rear of the house for storing grain and supplies. The general store operated from a portion of the ground floor, so that commerce and domestic life shared the same walls, the same roof, the same front door. This arrangement was practical for a frontier merchant, but it also meant something else. It meant the house was never entirely private. From its first day, the Whaley house belonged partly to the public. On the 22nd of August, 1857, Thomas and Anna moved in with their children. Francis Hinton was 2 years old. Thomas Jr. had been born the year before. Anna Amelia would arrive in 1858, followed by George Hay Ringgold in 1860, Violet Eloise in 1862, and Corinne Lillian in 1864. 6 children in 8 years. The house filled with noise and motion and the ordinary accumulation of a growing family. Music lessons, meals, visitors, the daily rhythm of a household that was also a place of business. The town noticed. The San Diego Herald praised the Whaley House as the finest home in Southern California, the first of its kind in the region, a building that elevated the reputation of the entire settlement. Neighbors came to see the carpets, the furniture, the imported glass. The house became a social center almost immediately. Dances were held there, meetings convened. The community gathered in the Whaley parlor, the way it might gather in a town hall. Because in a town this small, there was no meaningful distinction between the two. Thomas Whaley had achieved exactly what he set out to achieve. He had taken a patch of execution ground, dirt that his neighbors would not touch, land marked by a slow and public death, and transformed it into the most admired address in the region. The gallows were gone. The bricks had risen. The carpets covered the earth. If there were whispers about what had happened on this ground 3 years before Thomas laid his foundation, those whispers were drowned out by music from the parlor and the laughter of children on the staircase. And for a brief window of time, the house was everything Thomas had promised it would be. It was comfortable. It was handsome. It was convenient. Anna kept a meticulous home. Thomas ran his store and expanded his business dealings. The children grew. The community depended on the house, and the house repaid that dependence with warmth and utility and the particular gravity that a well-built structure lends to the people inside it. A fine house makes its occupants feel fine. It tells them they are established, that they belong, that the future is solid beneath their feet. But a house that serves too many purposes becomes vulnerable in ways that a simple home does not. When the Whaley house was just a residence, its fortunes were tied only to the family. Once it became a store, a gathering place, a public institution, its fortunes were tied to the town. If the town prospered, the house prospered. If the town declined, or turned hostile, or moved its center of gravity 4 miles south to a better harbor, the house would absorb that loss too. Thomas Whaley had built a building that was inseparable from the community around it. He had made his private life and his public life the same structure, the same investment, the same bet. It was efficient. It was also a trap. None of this was visible in 1857. What was visible was a Greek Revival house on a hill in the California sun. Its bricks bright and its windows catching light. Its rooms full of furniture shipped from the East Coast and children born on the West. Its owner standing in the doorway of the finest home for 150 miles in any direction, entirely certain that the worst was behind him. Thomas Whaley Jr. was 17 months old. He had 10 months left to live. Scarlet fever moved through frontier towns the way fire moved through dry timber. It arrived without warning, spread through households with indifferent efficiency, and left behind either recovery or a small grave. There was no vaccine in 1858. There was no reliable treatment. A child developed a sore throat, then a rash, then a high fever, and the family waited to see which way the illness would turn. In many cases, especially in children under 2, it turned toward death. Thomas Whaley Jr. had been born on the 18th of August, 1856. The same summer his father began laying bricks for the house. He was the second child, the second son, named for his father and his grandfather before him. He was 17 months old when the fever took hold. On the 29th of January 1858, he died inside the house his father had built for him. There is no record of what Thomas and Anna said to each other in the days that followed. There is no diary entry that captures the particular silence of a house where a child has just died. What we know is that they buried their son and continued living in the same rooms where he had been sick, in the same house where his absence now occupied a specific and permanent space. The nursery did not become a different room because the child was gone. The staircase did not change. The walls did not rearrange themselves out of sympathy. The house simply continued being a house, which is both the mercy and the cruelty of architecture. Buildings do not grieve, they persist. Anna was pregnant again, or would be soon. Anna Amelia was born in June of 1858, 5 months after the boy's death. Life continued because life does, and because Thomas and Anna Whaley were not people who stopped. They had crossed a continent, survived arson, built a house from raw earth, and buried a child, and they were still standing in the doorway of the finest home in Southern California, still running the store, still receiving visitors, still keeping the lamps lit. But something had shifted. The house that was supposed to be impervious, the brick house, the permanent house, the house that would not burn, had failed to protect the most vulnerable person inside it. Thomas Whaley had built against fire and wind and time. He had not built against fever. Then came the second blow. The family store, which operated from inside the house or in an adjacent structure, was destroyed by an arson fire. The details in the historical record are thin. We know the fire was deliberately set, and we know it destroyed the inventory and the structure. For Thomas Whaley, this was San Francisco all over again. He had watched fire consume his livelihood once before, on Montgomery Street, and he had responded by moving south and building in brick. Now fire had followed him. The store was gone, and with it the income that sustained the household. It is difficult to overstate what these two losses meant in sequence: a dead child and a burned store within the same year. The house still stood. Brick does not burn the way timber does, but the life inside it had been gutted. Thomas Whaley was a man who solved problems by building. When San Francisco burned, he built again in San Diego. When other men used wood, he used brick. When the lot carried a bad reputation, he laid carpets over it. But you cannot build your way out of a dead child, and you cannot lay brick against grief. For the first time in his adult life, Thomas Whaley did not rebuild. He left. In January of 1859, Thomas turned his affairs in Old Town over to Frank Ames, a Wells Fargo agent, and moved his family to San Francisco. The Whaley house, the handsomest, most comfortable and convenient place within 150 miles, stood empty. The carpets remained. The furniture remained. The drapes hung in the windows over rooms where no one slept. The house waited, which is all a house can do when the people who gave it purpose are gone. The family would remain away for nearly a decade. During those years, Thomas pursued various employments in San Francisco and elsewhere, including a period in Alaska. The historical record for these years is sparse, and that sparseness is itself revealing. Thomas Whaley, who had been so prominent in San Diego, a merchant, a civic figure, a builder of the town's most important house, disappeared into the anonymity of a larger city. He was no longer the man with the finest home. He was a man with a dead son, and a burned store, and a vacant building 400 miles to the south. What matters about this period is not what Thomas Whaley did while he was away. What matters is what his absence meant for the house. For nearly 10 years, the Whaley house sat unoccupied in a town that was itself beginning to empty. Old Town San Diego in the early 1860s was not growing. It was contracting, losing people and commerce to the promise of better harbors and better opportunities elsewhere. The house that had been the center of the community was now a monument to a community that was slowly dispersing. Dust gathered on the Brussels carpets. The bricks, made from the same earth where Yankee Jim had choked at the end of a rope, stood in their courses and held their shape. The house did not decay, not yet. But it was no longer alive in the way that a house is alive when people walk its floors and light its fires and argue at its table and sing in its parlor. Thomas Whaley would come back. He would always come back. That was both his strength and his affliction. He could not stay in the house, and he could not stay away from it. The building had its grip on him, the way a promise has its grip on the man who made it. He had declared this house the finest in the territory. He had bet his name on it, and so he would return to it, and he would fill it again with commerce and theater and law, and he would dare the ground beneath it to do its worst. The ground was patient. It could wait. In the summer of 1868, Thomas Whaley loaded a stock of merchandise and headed south from San Francisco. He was 44 years old. He had been away from San Diego for nearly a decade, and in that time the town had changed in ways that mattered. A man named Alonzo Horton had arrived in 1867 and begun purchasing vast tracts of land along the harbor, several miles south of Old Town, with the intention of building a new city center closer to the waterfront. The development was already being called New Town. It had better access to shipping, flatter ground, and the energy of men who believed the future lay somewhere other than the mesa, where Thomas Whaley had staked his claim. Thomas knew about Horton's development. He came back anyway. He came back to Old Town, to the house he had built from his own bricks, to the rooms where his second son had died and his store had burned. He repaired the damage, restocked the shelves, and reopened for business. Anna and the remaining children, Francis, Anna Amelia, George, Violet, and Corinne, arrived in San Diego on the 12th of December 1868. The family was together again inside the house on San Diego Avenue, and Thomas Whaley was once more a merchant in Old Town. But the house he returned to was not the house he had left. A decade of vacancy had taken its toll, not on the bricks but on the context. Old Town was smaller now, quieter, more uncertain of its own future. The energy of the settlement had begun to shift toward Horton's New Town, and the merchants who remained in Old Town could feel the current pulling away from them. Thomas Whaley responded to this decline the way he always responded to adversity. He did not retreat, he expanded. In October of 1868, just weeks after his return, Thomas converted one of the upstairs bedrooms into a theater. The Tanner Troupe, a traveling theatrical company, performed in the space from October 1868 through January 1869. It was San Diego's first commercial theater, not a saloon stage, not a church basement repurposed for a Christmas pageant, but a dedicated performance space with an audience and a program and tickets sold at the door. The bedroom where the Whaley children had slept became a place where strangers sat in rows and watched actors perform by lamplight. The private had become public. The intimate had become commercial. And Thomas Whaley had made it happen by opening another door in a house that already had too many. Then came the courthouse. In August of 1869, San Diego County leased a portion of the Whaley House for use as its official courthouse and records repository. The former granary at the rear of the house was converted into a courtroom. 3 upstairs rooms were rented for storing legal documents and county records. Judges heard cases in the same building where the Whaley family ate dinner. Defendants stood trial under the same roof where children practiced piano. The county paid rent, and Thomas Whaley accepted it because the income was needed and because he believed the courthouse gave the house, and by extension, Old Town, a civic anchor that would hold against the pull of New Town. It is worth considering what the Whaley House had become by 1870. It was simultaneously a family residence, a general store, a former theater, and the seat of county government. Legal proceedings and domestic life shared walls, staircases, and sometimes the same hours of the day. A woman could be nursing an infant upstairs while a judge sentenced a man to prison downstairs. A child could be playing in the hallway while clerks filed land disputes in the next room. The house had no boundary between its public function and its private life because Thomas Whaley had erased that boundary, one lease at a time, one conversion at a time, one act of expansion after another. This arrangement made the house essential. It also made the house a target. If the courthouse was the anchor holding Old Town together, then anyone who wanted Old Town to fail needed only to pull that anchor up. And by 1870, the men building New Town wanted exactly that. Every merchant who relocated south to Horton's development, every dollar of commerce that followed the harbor, every family that chose a New Town lot over an Old Town adobe, all of it weakened the case for keeping the county seat where it was. The Whaley House was no longer just a home or even a civic building. It was a position in a political war, and Thomas Whaley was holding it with the stubbornness of a man who had already lost too much to lose again. Thomas offered several times to sell the house to the county outright. The county ignored him. He offered to negotiate a longer lease. The offers went unanswered. The New Town faction did not want to buy the courthouse. They wanted to move it. And they were willing to do so by methods that had nothing to do with negotiation. The house stood at the center of everything: the family, the store, the law, the conflict, and Thomas Whaley seemed not to notice or not to care. That centrality is another word for exposure. When a house is the most important building in town, everyone knows where to find it. Everyone knows what is inside it. And when the time comes to take something from that house, no one has to search. The time was coming. It was March of 1871, and Thomas Whaley was out of town on business. Anna was home with the children. The courthouse records were upstairs, and a group of men from Newtown had decided that those records did not belong in Old Town anymore. The precise sequence of what happened on the night of March 31st, 1871, varies slightly depending on the source. What does not vary is the outcome. A group of men aligned with the Newtown faction came to the Whaley house while Thomas was away. They came for the courthouse records, and they took them. Anna Whaley was inside the house with her children. The men entered. Some accounts say they forced their way in. Others suggest they arrived with a veneer of legal authority and demanded the county documents stored in the upstairs rooms. Anna confronted them. By one account, she was met on the staircase and held there, unable to stop the removal. By another, she argued with the men at the door while they carried boxes past her. The details differ, but the essential image remains the same. A woman standing in her own home, in the building her husband had designed and built and filled with his family's life, watching strangers remove the instruments of civic authority from under her roof. The children were present. The house was being emptied of its public purpose while the family stood inside it and could do nothing. The records were loaded and transported to Horton's Hall, a building on 6th and F Streets in the heart of Newtown, several miles south of Old Town. The county courthouse was no longer in the Whaley house. It was no longer in Old Town at all. The transfer was, in political terms, the moment Old Town San Diego lost its fight to remain the center of the city. The geographic and governmental heart of San Diego had shifted south, toward the harbor, toward Alonzo Horton's vision, and it would never shift back. For Thomas Whaley, the raid was more than a political defeat. It was a violation. His house had been entered. His wife had been confronted. His property, not just the building, but the arrangement he had made with the county, the rent he was owed, the civic role he had cultivated, had been stripped away in a single night while he was not there to defend it. The man who had built the finest home in Southern California, who had made his house the seat of government, who had offered to sell the building to the county and been ignored, now stood in a house that was no longer a courthouse, no longer a theater, no longer essential to anyone outside his own family. Thomas Whaley did what Thomas Whaley always did. He fought. He entered the legal system and began pursuing compensation for the loss of his courthouse lease, for the manner in which the records had been removed, for the treatment of his wife and family during the seizure. He filed claims. He wrote letters. He engaged attorneys. He pursued the matter through one court and then another, seeking not merely money, but acknowledgement, some formal recognition that what had been done to his house and his family was wrong. He never received it. The legal battle stretched across years, then across decades. Thomas Whaley spent the next 20 years of his life seeking redress for what happened on the night of March 31, 1871, and the courts never gave him satisfaction. The county had moved on. Newtown had won. The Whaley house was a private residence again, nothing more, and the man who had built it was left arguing with a system that had already decided the argument was over. What the raid cost the Whaley family cannot be measured only in lost rent or legal fees. It cost them their position. In a small town, the family whose house serves as the courthouse occupies a particular place in the social order. They are hosts to the law itself. Their home is where disputes are settled, where property is recorded, where the community performs its most formal rituals of order. When the courthouse left the Whaley house, the family lost that status. They became, overnight, simply a family in a large brick house on the wrong side of a town that was being abandoned. After the county's departure, Thomas connected the former courtroom and granary to the main residence, altered the front portico, changed windows and doors. He was absorbing the courthouse back into the house, erasing the institutional spaces and converting them into domestic ones, as if he could undo the loss by remodeling around it. The room where judges had sat became another room in a family home. The storage where legal documents had been filed became a closet or a bedroom. The house contracted. It had been a public institution. Now it was private again, and smaller for it. From 1874 to 1879, Thomas left San Diego once more, returning to New York and then traveling to San Francisco in search of employment. Anna and the children remained behind, or moved with him, depending on the period. The historical record for these years is thin and somewhat contradictory, which itself tells a story. Thomas Whaley, who had once been so visible in San Diego, so central to its daily commerce and governance, had become difficult to track. He was not building, he was not expanding. He was pursuing a legal claim that would never be resolved, and looking for work in cities where no one knew his house. When the family eventually settled back into the house on San Diego Avenue, they returned to a changed landscape. Old Town was quieter than it had been. The merchants had largely gone south. The streets were emptier. The house still stood. The bricks were holding. The structure was sound, but the world around it had receded. The Whaley house was no longer the finest home in the most important part of town. It was the finest home in a neighborhood that the city had left behind. Inside that house, the Whaley children were growing up. Francis was a young man now. Anna Amelia and George were approaching adulthood. Corinne was a teenager. And Violet Eloise, the fifth child born in 1862, the one who played piano and guitar, the one her father described as naturally lively, was 20 years old and about to make the decision that would define the house forever. Violet Eloise Whaley was born on the 14th of October, 1862, the fifth of Thomas and Anna's 6 children. She grew up inside the house her father had built, which means she grew up inside a building that was never simply a home. She practiced piano in rooms where judges had heard cases. She climbed a staircase where her mother had once been confronted by strangers. She slept under a roof that had sheltered a theater, a store, a courtroom, and a family that had already buried one child in the ground beneath it. Violet did not choose to grow up in this house. No child chooses. But the house shaped her, as houses shape everyone who lives long enough inside them. By the accounts that survive, Violet was bright, musical, and sociable. Her father described her as naturally lively. She played piano and guitar. She seems to have been the kind of young woman whose energy filled a room, whose presence announced itself without effort. In photographs from the period, she appears composed and direct, with the particular stillness that Victorian portraiture required, but that cannot entirely conceal the personality beneath it. She was, by all available evidence, a young woman with a future. On the 5th of January, 1882, Violet married George T. Bertolacci in a double wedding ceremony held inside the Whaley house. Her sister Anna Amelia married their cousin, John T. Whaley, the son of Thomas's brother Henry, on the same day. A double wedding in the family home. 2 daughters married on the same afternoon in the same parlor, under the same roof. It must have seemed, for a moment, like the house was fulfilling its original promise. Life was proceeding as it should. The next generation was beginning. The marriage lasted approximately 2 weeks. The precise circumstances of the collapse differ slightly depending on the source. Some accounts say Bertolacci abandoned Violet during their honeymoon, leaving her alone on a rail journey to the East Coast. Others say he remained for a short time before disappearing. The Whaley House Museum's own historian has noted that while Bertolacci was not a good man, the timeline of his departure may be less dramatic than the most popular versions suggest. What is not disputed is the outcome. George Bertolacci had married Violet Whaley for access to her family's wealth. When the fortune proved less than he expected, or when he had extracted what he could, he vanished. The marriage was over. What remained was the scandal. In 1882, a divorced woman in San Diego occupied a specific and unforgiving place in the social order. Divorce was legal but not acceptable. A woman who had been left by her husband was not regarded as a victim. She was regarded as a failure, or worse, as damaged. The shame attached not to the man who had committed the fraud, but to the woman who had been deceived by it. Violet returned to her father's house, the only place she could go. And the community responded with the particular cruelty that small towns reserve for women whose private lives have become public knowledge. Violet withdrew. She locked herself in her room for days at a time. Her father noticed the change and later described it plainly. She had shown no particular life or interest for some time, he said. She was naturally of a lively nature, and loved music very much. She seemed to take more interest in such things lately, and they thought she was getting better. That last detail is the one that lingers. They thought she was getting better. The family saw her return to the piano, her renewed engagement with music, and interpreted it as recovery. They did not recognize it as a farewell. On the morning of August 18, 1885, Violet Whaley took her father's .32 caliber Smith & Wesson pistol from his study, walked to the outhouse behind the house, and shot herself through the heart. She was 22 years old. Her family found her and brought her inside. They also found a letter. Violet's farewell was not written in her own words. It was a passage copied from a poem by Thomas Hood, published in 1844, called The Bridge of Sighs. The poem had been written about a young woman in London who drowned herself in the Thames, a woman cast out, judged and abandoned by the society that should have protected her. The lines Violet chose were these: mad from life's history, swift to death's mystery, glad to be hurled, anywhere, anywhere, out of this world. She did not explain, she did not accuse. She borrowed the words of another woman's despair, from another century, from another country, and offered them as her own. The poem said everything she needed to say, and nothing that could be argued with. She was done with this world, and she chose a verse that had been written about a woman just like her, used, shamed, and discarded, to say so. The aftermath radiated outward from the house like a shockwave. Violet's death became an immediate scandal in San Diego, and the Whaley family, already diminished by the loss of the courthouse and the decline of Old Town, was cast in a harsh and public light. Corinne Lillian, the youngest Whaley daughter, was engaged to be married at the time of Violet's death. Her fiancé broke off the engagement. He did not want to be associated with a family marked by this kind of grief. One act of despair, committed in an outhouse behind a brick house on a quiet street, had now destroyed two futures. Violet was dead, and Corinne's chance at a conventional life, the marriage, the household, the social standing that a union would have provided, was gone. Thomas Whaley could not stay in the house. He had stayed after his son died. He had stayed after the store burned. He had stayed after the courthouse was taken. But he could not stay after Violet. He built a new, single-story house on State Street in downtown San Diego and moved the family out. The Whaley House on San Diego Avenue, the finest home in Southern California, the building that had been a store and a theater and a courthouse and a home, fell dark for the second time. This time, the darkness would last more than 20 years. Thomas Whaley lived for 5 more years after leaving the house. He and Anna and the remaining children settled into the new home on State Street, a single-story dwelling that was, by every measure, a lesser building. It was not Greek Revival. It was not the finest anything. It was simply a place to live, built by a man who no longer had the will to make grand declarations in brick and glass. Thomas was 63 years old when Violet died. He had spent his adult life building, losing, rebuilding, and losing again. The State Street house was not a monument. It was a surrender. His health declined. The historical record does not specify the exact nature of his illness, only that it was progressive, and that it kept him confined in the years before the end. Thomas Whaley died on the 14th of December, 1890, at the age of 67, inside the State Street house. He did not die in the building he had designed. He did not die in the rooms he had furnished with mahogany and rosewood, or beneath the roof he had raised from bricks he manufactured with his own hands. He died 4 miles away, in a smaller house, in a newer part of a city that had already moved past him. He was buried at Mount Hope Cemetery in San Diego. His legal claims against the county for the courthouse raid of 1871 remained unresolved. 20 years of petitions and filings and letters, and no satisfaction, no compensation, no formal acknowledgement that what had been done to his family and his house had been wrong. The courts had outlasted him. The county had outlasted him. The only thing Thomas Whaley left behind that still stood exactly as he had built, it was the house on San Diego Avenue, and it was empty. The house remained vacant for nearly 20 years after the family moved out. During that time, Old Town continued its long contraction. The streets grew quieter. The population thinned. The center of San Diego's civic and commercial life was now firmly established in the downtown district that Alonzo Horton had willed into existence. The Whaley house stood in a neighborhood that the city had passed by, its windows dark, its rooms holding dust and silence, and the particular atmosphere of a building that has been left alone with its history. At some point during these years, a railway line was constructed that ran directly in front of the house. Trains from the San Diego and Pacific Beach Railway rattled past the building on light rails, shaking the already aging structure. The vibrations may have contributed to the deterioration that was already underway. Walls sagging, cracks widening, windows needing to be replaced, and the openings reduced in size to accommodate additional brickwork for structural support. The house that Thomas Whaley had built to last was being undermined not by fire or raid but by neglect and the slow tremor of progress passing its front door. Then, in late 1909, Francis Whaley came back. Francis was the eldest surviving child, born in 1854, the boy named after his father's business partner. He was now in his mid-50s, and he returned to the house where he had grown up with the intention of restoring it. He posted signs promoting the building's historical significance. He played guitar for visitors who came to see the old brick house. He was, in a sense, the first person to understand that the Whaley house had become something other than a home, that its value now lay not in what it could provide to a family, but in what it could tell to strangers. Francis Whaley was trying to turn the family's history into a public attraction, which was either an act of preservation or an act of repetition. The house had always been partly public. Now it would be entirely so. Anna Whaley, Thomas's widow, moved back into the house with Francis. Corinne returned as well. George, the fourth child, was also living in the house by 1912. The family had gathered again inside the building they had fled after Violet's death, and one by one they died there. Anna Whaley died in the house on the 24th of February 1913. She was 80 years old. She had lived in this building as a young bride, had raised 6 children in it, had been confronted on its staircase by men who came to take the courthouse records, had buried a son and a daughter and a husband, had left it twice and returned twice. She died in the same rooms where she had hung damask drapes more than half a century earlier. Francis Whaley died in the house on the 19th of November 1914, less than 2 years after his mother. He was 60 years old. The man who had come back to restore the building and tell its story did not outlive his project. George Whaley died on the 5th of January 1928. Of the 6 children Thomas and Anna had raised in the house, 3, Thomas Jr., Violet, and Anna Amelia, who had died in Modesto in 1905, were already gone. Now Francis and George were gone too. That left Corinne. Corinne Lillian Whaley, the youngest, born in 1864, the one whose engagement had been destroyed by the scandal of Violet's death. She had never married. She had never built a separate life away from the family and its house. She remained in the building on San Diego Avenue, the last Whaley in a house built for 10, walking the same hallways her father had designed, sitting in the same parlor where her sisters had been married and her brother had died. She lived there alone for 25 years after George's death. Corinne was eventually moved to a nursing home before her death in 1953. The house stood empty for the 3rd time in its history. But this time, there was no Whaley left to come back. The family was finished. Every person who had lived in the house, from Thomas the Builder to Corinne the last, was gone. The bricks remained. The walls held. The foundation sat on the same earth where Yankee Jim Robinson had swung from a rope a century before. The house had outlived everyone who loved it. Whether that constitutes a haunting depends on what you believe a haunting is. By the mid-1950s, the Whaley house was an orphan. Corinne was dead. No family member remained to claim it or care for it. The building sat in a neighborhood that was itself caught between demolition and nostalgia, as Old Town San Diego struggled to decide whether its past was worth preserving, or whether the land beneath these aging structures would be better served by something new. Across the country, in cities large and small, historic buildings were falling to the wrecking ball in the name of progress. The Whaley House, for all its history, was not immune to that arithmetic. It was old, it was deteriorating, and it occupied real estate that developers could see value in. The finest home in Southern California was for a brief and precarious moment a candidate for demolition. What saved it was a small group of people who understood that the building carried something worth keeping. In 1956, the San Diego Historical Shrine Foundation was formed, led by James E. Redding and June A. Strudwick Reading, with the specific goal of preserving the Whaley House. They lobbied the county. They raised money. They argued correctly that this building was not simply a house but a document, a physical record of San Diego's earliest civic life, its first commercial theater, its second courthouse, its transition from frontier settlement to American city. The building was the evidence. If it fell, the evidence fell with it. In 1960, the effort succeeded. The County of San Diego leased the property to the foundation, and the Whaley House opened as a museum on the 25th of May. The restoration was painstaking. Rooms were returned to their mid-19th century appearance. Original furnishings, or faithful reproductions, were placed in the parlor, the dining room, the study, the courtroom. The theater space upstairs was preserved. The general store was reconstructed. The house was reassembled, room by room, into an approximation of what it had been when Thomas and Anna first walked through the front door in 1857. Visitors could now stand in the parlor, where the double wedding had been held, walk through the courtroom where judges had sentenced men while children played overhead, and climb the staircase where Anna had been confronted during the raid. The same year the museum opened, the United States Department of Commerce reportedly recognized the Whaley House as a haunted house, a distinction that few buildings in the country have received from a federal agency. The designation was unusual, and its precise origins have been debated by historians and skeptics alike. But its effect was undeniable. The Whaley House entered the national consciousness not as a historical landmark, but as a site of paranormal activity. The ghosts became the story. The history became the backdrop. Over the decades that followed, the haunting narrative grew. The Travel Channel named it the most haunted house in America. Television programs filmed inside its rooms. Visitors reported hearing footsteps on the second floor, attributed to Yankee Jim Robinson, walking in the heavy boots he wore to the gallows. They smelled cigar smoke in rooms where no one was smoking, which they attributed to Thomas Whaley, who had been fond of cigars. They detected the scent of lavender perfume, said to belong to Anna. They heard a baby crying upstairs and believed it was Thomas Jr. They felt an oppressive weight near the archway between the parlor and the music room, the spot where the gallows had once stood. They saw the figure of a young woman on the second floor and called her Violet. More than 100,000 people visit the Whaley House every year. Most of them come for the ghosts. They come for the cold spots and the flickering lights and the possibility of contact with something that defies explanation. They stand in the parlor and wait for something to move. They climb the staircase and hope to feel a chill on the 9th step, where Anna supposedly encountered the men who came for the records. They take photographs and examine them for anomalies. They want the house to be haunted because a haunted house confirms something they already believe: that the dead do not leave, that suffering imprints itself on walls, that a building can hold what the people inside it could not. But consider what they are actually standing inside. They are standing in a house built by a man who watched a stranger die on that very ground and decided to raise his family there anyway. They are standing in a building where a 17-month-old boy died of scarlet fever, where a store burned, where a courthouse was stolen in the night, where a young woman shot herself through the heart with her father's pistol and left behind someone else's poem because she could not find her own words for the weight of what had been done to her. They are standing in a house that was abandoned 3 separate times by the family that built it, once after a death, once after a violation, Once, after a final loss so complete that the remaining children drifted back to it one by one over decades, as if they had nowhere else to go, and died inside it because the house was the only thing that had not left them. That is not a ghost story. That is a family story. It is the story of a man who believed he could build a life that nothing could touch. Not fire, not death, not politics, not grief, and who chose the worst possible ground to prove it. It is the story of a woman who was failed by a husband, a community, and an era, and whose only recourse was to borrow the words of a poet who had written about a woman just like her 40 years earlier, in a country she had never seen. It is the story of a house that became everything a town could need: home, store, theater, courthouse, and in doing so became a vessel for every misfortune a family could endure. The Whaley house still stands at 2476 San Diego Avenue in the Old Town neighborhood of a city that grew around it and beyond it, and in some fundamental sense away from it. The bricks Thomas Whaley fired in his own kiln in 1856 are still holding their courses. The walls are still plumb. The roof still keeps the rain out. It is the oldest brick structure in Southern California, a California historical landmark, a museum, a tourist attraction, and, depending on whom you ask, the most haunted house in America. But haunting is just another word for memory that will not leave a building alone. And in the case of the Whaley house, the memory is not supernatural. It is historical. It is documented. It is a man who built on execution ground and spent his life pretending that did not matter. It is a daughter who died because her world punished women for the sins of men. It is a family that kept coming back to a house that kept taking from them because the house was the only proof that they had ever been here at all. The bricks hold. The family is gone. And the house, as it has always done, remains.